What we expect will be a very insightful and stimulating debate here to the University of Chicago, and getting to the root of the issue here. The heart of the debate, we have Mr. Zachary Elkins and Clark Neily, and they will be debating the motion that the Second Amendment should be amended. So, Zachary Elkins is an associate professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin, where he focuses his research on issues of democracy, institutional reform, research methods, and national identity. And he is also the co-author of a book called The Endurance of National Constitutions, which takes a closer look at the elements that allows a national constitution to endure. And Professor Elkins will be debating in favor of the motion. And debating against the motion will be Clark Neily, a senior attorney at the Institute for Justice. Mr. Neily represented privately the plaintiffs in District of Columbia versus Heller, the Supreme Court case that held that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to keep a gun for self-defense. And he also serves as the director for the Institute of Justice's Center for Judicial Engagement. And moderating tonight's debate will be Azhar Majid, the Director of Policy Reform at FIRE. Azhar studied political science and history at the University of Michigan before earning his law degree from Michigan Law School. So with that, please join me in welcoming tonight's discussants.
Good evening. My name is Azhar Majid, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight for the fourth installment of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education's FIREdebates. FIRE is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to defending civil liberties on college campuses across the country. And I'm proud to serve as FIRE's Director of Policy Reform. Following tonight's event, please visit the table located at the side of the theater for more information about FIRE's work. After tonight, FIRE will have sponsored 4 debates at major universities across the country, and we're honored to have the final one tonight at the University of Chicago in partnership with the Institute of Politics, excuse me. Being here tonight couldn't be more appropriate given the University of Chicago's commitment to free speech. FIRE is proud to say that just last week, UChicago earned FIRE's highest green light rating for campus free speech. So it's an honor for us to be here tonight on this beautiful campus. And we are very grateful to UChicago and the Institute of Politics for having us. At FIRE, we believe that colleges must empower students to speak up, to question, to challenge themselves and their peers. No viewpoint or opinion should be safe from scrutiny or discussion. Testing ideas strengthens arguments, changes minds, and promotes greater understanding between those that may never see eye to eye on a given issue. We may not all agree. In fact, it's more interesting if we don't. But in our democracy, we must be able to talk to one another and to find truth via dialogue. The FIRE debate series brings high-quality debates to campus to demonstrate that free inquiry and open discussion play a central role in both higher education and in our democracy at large, and to remind all of us in these polarized political times that debating can be fun. All of us at FIRE very much hope you leave tonight's event with a renewed sense of the importance of open discussion and open inquiry, and with a renewed attitude that all students and speakers should be free to disagree. Please pay close attention to our distinguished debaters tonight. And if you'd like to tell your social media followers about the back and forth, please use the hashtag FIREdebates. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce the debaters for tonight's topic. I should actually introduce the topic itself and give you a little bit of a short understanding of the topic. After every mass shooting, after every episode of public violence, the debate over the meaning of the Second Amendment is rehashed in the media and in the court of public opinion. Much of the conversation centers around what the nation's founding fathers intended when the Second Amendment was written over 200 years ago. But would gun control advocates be better off working to amend the Second Amendment? And thus, the motion for tonight's debate is the Second Amendment should be amended. And with that, I will allow for opening statements from our debaters, starting with Zachary Elkins.
Okay, thank you, Azar. It really is a privilege and honor to be with you tonight and to be sharing the stage with Clark Neily, who I really respect quite a bit. It's clear to me that he has a very deep and sincere commitment to rights and liberties. So, should the Second Amendment be revised? I think so. I think there's widespread agreement in this country about what to do about guns, but I think the Second Amendment is both confusing and polarizing. I think rewriting it and clarifying it will give us a solid foundation to proceed and balance really carefully both our rights, our freedom, and our safety. So I have deep respect for the founders. They're obviously working under trying circumstances and very novel circumstances. But they've crafted a constitution, that has proved to be remarkably stable and certainly adaptable. And in general, I'm not in favor of making changes to higher law unless we actually have to. But I do think there are times in which it makes sense. The founders did include some amendment procedures in Article 5 for a reason. And sometimes a document needs updating, and I think we're at that moment right now. So the Second Amendment really is confusing, as I mentioned at the outset, and maybe especially for judges. Just let's recall that the Supreme Court really hadn't done much with the Second Amendment for 200 years. And then in 2008, they finally took it up seriously. And what did they say when they did take it up? Well, first they argued endlessly, and I'd say tendentiously, about what the founders were thinking about words like bear and arms and the people. And the historical analysis by these justices, I think, is not very even-handed by either side or very compelling. And I think historians would agree. And ultimately, we were left with a 5-4 decision in that Heller case, the biggest headline of which was that the Second Amendment contains an individual right to bear arms. The fine print actually is much more nuanced. But non-lawyers don't focus on fine print, and I think that really matters for reasons I'll describe. So meanwhile, if you read the written the opinions, the two sides disparaged each other with words like wrong-headed, plain wrong, and my personal favorite, dead wrong. And by the way, there are 5 other uses of the word wrong in those opinions. And if you're somebody who's under the impression that Supreme Court opinions are not interesting to read or are overly subtle, I suggest you take a look. But now Scalia is gone. He was, of course, the author of the majority opinion. And gone with him are some of those more colorful opinions. And no immediate replacement is in sight for Scalia. And as a result, the court is now deadlocked in a 4-4 tie, or at least an expected 4-4 tie should this issue come up again. So you can see why people might be worried, or at least uncertain on either side. The NRA lawyers, they say, or at least tweet, that Merrick Garland, or any other Obama or Hillary appointee, or Bernie appointee, would overturn Heller. Our junior senator from Texas, who the last I checked is still in the race, although today's primary in Indiana may have actually pushed him out, but he's suggested the same thing. So he has a line from his stump speech that basically says we're one justice away from losing the right to bear arms. And by the way, if Trump does win the nomination and we follow Cruz's logic, it means that Donald Trump is really the only thing that stands in the way of dismantling gun rights, which might be interesting to talk about. And of course, there's lots of hysteria and rhetoric in any campaign, but I think that rhetoric matters. It contributes to political polarization, which, as I mentioned at the outset, and polarization is a real thing. We've seen that mistrust and antagonism between the two sides is getting in the way of really any sort of major undertaking that government should be involved in, even things like as simple as the budget. So it's worth paying attention to that sort of hysteria. But let's get back to the text of what I said, the confusing Second Amendment. The source of the disagreement is, of course, about the two clauses in the Second Amendment. The first, the prefatory clause, the militia clause, is the one that those in favor of regulation focus on. And of course, the operative clause, the second clause, the one about not infringing rights, is the one that the opposite side focuses on. But I think that the Supreme Court's disagreement and dysfunction on this matter really lies in stark contrast to what I think is agreement among the American people. I think the consensus among Americans is simply this, that there is, for all intent and purposes, an individual right to bear arms, but it's coupled with reasonable regulations. So you'll see that if we were to reformulate the Second Amendment along these lines, it essentially amounts to dispensing with the militia clause, which gun rights advocates would appreciate. But it also involves adding a clause that adds for reasonable restrictions, or sort of suggests explicitly the idea of reasonable restrictions. So it's a good deal for both sides. It might be a better deal for the gun rights side, I don't know. But I have no illusions that it would be passed. Given our polarized politics and given the myth of the U.S. Constitution, how difficult it is to amend it, I'm starting to think that we actually might need Donald Trump in order to make this deal. But I think it's worth thinking about. But let's come back to Heller. And of course, Clark was very involved as one of the counsels for the plaintiffs in arguing that opinion, so it's interesting to talk about. Most of the attention, as I said, about Heller had to do with its headline, the articulation of an individual right. But actually, as Clark will undoubtedly note today, Scalia, in his majority opinion, left lots of fine print that allowed all sorts of regulations to go forward. So the question is, if that's Heller, and if, as Heller stands, it's very similar to what I'm proposing as an amendment to the Second Amendment, then why? Why bother if Heller essentially is close enough to where I think most Americans stand? Well, let's think about it. I think that there's really good reason to have a national conversation about how we feel about guns and what our approach to guns is. And that, I think, in many ways amounts to changing the text for two reasons. One is policymaking, and I mentioned at the outset that we are in the throes, of course, of harsh political polarization. And we really, I think, need to depoliticize and depolarize, if you want, the Second Amendment, defang Second Amendment politics in a way to build a sort of much more solid foundation to actually build policies. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit as we get into it. But in essence, I think that the sort of deep-throated politics of the Second Amendment is stifling innovation in a very profound way. And I think it's also the case, and we'll get into this as well, that having a national conversation about what Heller means and what the Second Amendment really means is good for revitalizing our Constitution, which is something I think we can all support.
Okay. Please go ahead.
Well, thanks, Zach and Azar, for the opportunity to be here and have what I hope is going to be an interesting and stimulating conversation. I think that Zach and I are both particularly looking forward to questions from the audience. You know, it's easy when you've been working on an issue for a long time, like I have on this one, to assume that you can predict what people will be interested in discussing, but you're usually wrong. So there will be an opportunity for the audience to participate, and we're looking forward to that. But I'll share with you a few thoughts to get started. This is one of the small handful of constitutional issues on which I've more or less concluded that there's not much point in trying to change people's minds, and I mean that. There's a very small subset of policy issues, some of which happen also to be constitutional issues, where I've rarely seen anyone change their mind. So I'm actually not here to try to change anybody's mind, believe it or not. What I hope to accomplish, if anything, is instead to encourage people to think about the way they approach all public policy issues, including this one, and specifically to encourage the question of the Second Amendment and gun rights the way that I think most of us would hope that other people would approach other issues that we care about. I suspect everybody in the room has something else besides the Second Amendment and or gun rights that they care about. I hope you do. And hopefully something you care about even more, because I think there are far more important issues that we're facing as a country. Not to say that gun rights aren't important, but the number of people killed with guns every year in this country, while tragic, is not a very large number. Gun deaths are not even in the top 10 causes of death in the United States. There are other things that are far more lethal. For example, medical mistakes. Third largest cause of death, leading cause of death in America, kills about 10 times more people than guns. That's an issue that deserves careful thought and response. So my point is simply this. There is almost certainly something that you care about, and you would hope that people who are on the other side of that issue would approach it respectfully and with a commitment to trying to get it right by acquainting themselves with the facts and discussing the issue not on the basis of emotion or invective, but on the basis of facts, where both people are trying to get to a better understanding and ultimately a better policy. So that's my aspiration. I'd like to start with a story. That's one of the things you do as a public interest litigator. The Heller case, I will tell you, was deliberately designed by myself and two colleagues to be a public interest case, meaning we went out and looked for people who could be not only credible but appealing spokespeople for an individual right to own a gun. I'd like to tell you the story about one of them that most people have never heard of. We actually had 6 plaintiffs in the Heller case. Dick Heller was not the lead plaintiff initially. He came to be the only plaintiff because of some procedural developments in the case. But we did have 6 plaintiffs, and one of them was a man named Tom Palmer. Tom happens to be a friend of mine. My wife used to work with him when she was at the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank in DC. And Tom is openly gay. He was the vice president of Cato for policy. He's a PhD in philosophy, and he's very outspoken. And Tom was in California one time about 15 years ago, and he was walking along with a male companion. Noticed at one point that they were being followed by a group of But there is another side to that coin. Guns are sometimes used for perfectly legitimate, lawful purposes. Lives are saved with guns. In fact, 3 years ago in Washington, D.C., a man witnessed a little boy being attacked by 3 pit bulls. The little boy had ridden his bike into the pit bulls, and they began savagely attacking him. He ran into his house and retrieved his illegal handgun, came back and shot one of the pit bulls. The sound of the gunshot attracted a police officer who shot the other 2 pit bulls, and the boy's life was saved. The man was charged with having an illegal gun, but the prosecutors decided to let him off easy with a $1,000 fine and a deferred adjudication. These incidents are not as unusual as you might think. They are far from unusual. There's a debate among criminologists about how often guns are used for legitimate purposes to save lives and prevent crime, but the general agreement is that it's somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million times a year. So literally there is general consensus among criminologists, both who love guns and hate guns, across the spectrum, that about 1,000 times a day Americans use guns to protect themselves from crime or from violent attack. But that's a policy issue. It doesn't really shed much light on the constitutional issue. And the constitutional question is whether the Constitution does or does not protect the individual right to own guns. And second, whether if it does, we should change that in some way, or maybe that's really just the question is, regardless of what the Constitution says, should we change it? I think there are really only 3 basic ways that we could amend the Second Amendment. The first is to eliminate it. The second is to transform it into an outright prohibition, the way we did with alcohol and the 18th Amendment. That was in 1919. I take it you all know how that went here in Chicago. You're very familiar with how it went. And the third is to clarify it, as Zach is suggesting. As to the first, just simply eliminating the Second Amendment, literally deleting it from the text of the Constitution, guess what? We already know what that looks like, because for 217 years, the courts ignored the Second Amendment. And it wasn't until Heller in 2008 that the Supreme Court ever held that any gun law was implicated by the Second Amendment, ultimately struck down a complete ban in Washington, D.C. So if you want to know what America looks like with no Second Amendment, we know what it looks like because that's what it looked like up until 2008. What it looks like is the highest per capita gun ownership of any country in the world, relatively easy access to guns and carry permits, and a significant number of rules and restrictions about owning guns, but basically anybody without a criminal background and without a mental health history can get a gun. So that's what it looks like, and what we're really here to talk about today, I think, are the latter two. Should we change the Second Amendment to prohibit gun ownership, and what are the merits of that proposal, or should we simply clarify it as Zach is proposing, and what are the merits of that proposal?
All right. Thank you very much, Clark. We're going to move now to the second portion of this debate, which is questions from the moderator. I'm going to direct these questions to either one of our debaters, but I'm told that inter-panel challenges are encouraged, so feel free to jump in with your own thoughts in response. And I'll start with you, Zach. You talked a little bit about the Heller decision and what it may reflect about common understandings of the extent of the Second Amendment's protections. So what do you think are some of the areas of agreement among the American public about what the Second Amendment says? And also, what do you think the Supreme Court's Heller decision reflects about what it should say in terms of that public consensus?
So, surprisingly, when you read the Heller decision, or at least the majority opinions and the dissents, I think you read it and you think, okay, this is basically right. And the reason I'm saying that's surprising is most people take the headline that it proposes, and some would say invents, an individual right to bear arms. But when you read Scalia's opinion, you realize that he leaves open the possibility of all sorts of regulations on that right. So Clark would describe it as a very sort of thin slice that it leaves open to rights enthusiasts. And I think that's right. It doesn't really do much for gun owners, at least not as much as the headline would suggest. But one thing I think is that the decision itself is one thing, and we'll see courts dealing with that with years to come, and we'll see what, if any, courts decide to take it up and think about reversing it, which I think is doubtful. But I think it has itself a very strong effect on the rest of our politics. And one thing it does, I think, if you look at the Second Amendment symbolically, at least in popular culture. I was thinking recently about Curt Schilling, the Boston Red Sox pitcher who got in trouble with ESPN, was ultimately fired. But he said some very outspoken things. And when he described his politics, he said, well, my politics is basically Second Amendment politics. And what he means by that, in some ways, is sort of calling attention to this individual right, which is, of course, sort of the headline statement of the Second Amendment. But there's much more to that when you actually get into how that's adjudicated. And if you think about the effects that has on policymaking, you realize that there are other people down the line, both in state legislatures, city councils, and members of other jurisdictions, who are making decisions themselves interpreting the Second Amendment, or at least what they think the Second Amendment means, which makes sense. I can go into this in further detail, but I'll leave it there.
Sure. Do you have any response?
Yeah, so I think I want to make a couple of points about Zach's proposition that we clarify the Second Amendment and why I disagree, but not strongly. Just I don't think on balance that would be a good idea. The first, and Zach touched on this briefly, but I want to elaborate just a little bit. There is tremendous virtue in tradition. The United States has the longest lasting constitution of any major government in the world. In fact, we were the first country to specifically set up a written constitution and embody within it a plan of government. And I think many historians and political scientists would agree that there's something almost unique about Americans' attachment to their constitution and the way that we venerate our constitution. I was a Russian major undergrad, and I went to the Soviet Union. If you actually read the Soviet constitution back before the Soviet Union broke up, you would see that it contains all kinds of rights of free speech, rights of political association, et cetera. The problem is they're all meaningless. And so it matters tremendously to have a constitution that is both respected and venerated by the populace. And so when you start changing parts of it, you change the Second Amendment, which has been on the books since 1791, and replace it with something else, that new provision was not going to have that historical connection, that historical pedigree. And that may be a feature for some people. They may feel like, well, I like the idea of a weakened Second Amendment, one that doesn't have a 2-century-old pedigree and a connection to the founding era. But I don't. I would prefer to see the Constitution and all of its provisions maintain that strong historical connection unless it's absolutely necessary to change them. Second, I think there would be tremendous strife if we by the way, we have a national debate over gun policy every time there's a mass shooting. And what generally happens is things don't change very much. People seem by and large to and I'm not talking about individual people. I know that there are vastly different opinions in this room. But as a whole, when you look at polling numbers in America, there is widespread support for the idea that the Constitution protects an individual right to own guns subject to reasonable restrictions. And that's the last point I want to make is what counts as a reasonable restriction is something about which people can differ tremendously. So for example, Justice Breyer wrote a dissenting opinion in the Heller case in which all 4 dissenting justices joined. And he took the position that a complete ban, which is what we were challenging in Washington, D.C., the most sweeping disarmament of citizens on American soil since the British disarmed the colonists at Boston and slavery, was reasonable. So reasonable is a term through which you can drive a truck when you get down to actual constitutional adjudication. And so I don't think there's any more precision to be wrung out of the Second Amendment, and for that reason I would not support amending it.
Can I come in on this?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I think Clark brings up a very important point, and that is the reverence that many of us have for the U.S. Constitution. And I think that reverence is in some ways what that keeps it alive and keeps it enforced. I mean, let's face it, if an executive wants to transgress its boundaries, there's 9 aged justices are not going to stand in his or her way. And what you really need is consensus among the people that the executive has transgressed those boundaries for them to coordinate and step up and to contest that. So the reverence is actually quite important in citizens' attachment to the Constitution. But I think sort of ancient phrasings and relics like the Second Amendment actually get in the way of that reverence. The militia clause, we can talk about this more, but I don't think it makes very much sense today and could easily be disposed of. It actually creates all this confusion. And what we need is, I think, 2 things for something to be revered. I think we need to, I think it needs to actually be meaningful to us and connect to our values and our objectives. But I think we also need to understand it. Constitutions are now supposed to be credit card contracts that only lawyers can understand. They're supposed to be plainly written and easily understood by the public, who are then supposed to enforce it. So in both those points, I think mostly it's a connection to our values and it's being easily understood. I think the Second Amendment fails. But I also think, if we want to keep the Constitution vital and we want to keep it revered and keep it meaningful for us, I think it makes sense, at least now and then, not every 40 years, maybe a little more often than that, to just actually come every generation or 2 to make some small changes. And I think actually Madison would have been very happy if we did. I'm sure if he were here today, he'd be very proud that his Constitution is still here, but I think he'd also be a little disappointed in us that we haven't updated it. I think there are a couple ways to keep the Constitution alive. One is to allow the Supreme Court to interpret and reinterpret, to give it meaning and keep it alive. Certainly they can do that. But I think it's also the case that now and then we need a national conversation about what we want and to make at least some small changes to it.
Do you have any points on this, Tyson?
Brief one. I do think Madison would be extremely disappointed with what he saw today, and I think the Second Amendment would be really far down his list of things that he thinks need updating. We've abandoned what was for him the absolute centerpiece of the Constitution, which was the doctrine of limited federal powers. The Supreme Court eliminated that centerpiece of the Constitution, or virtually eliminated it during the New Deal, and I think Madison would be absolutely dismayed. But I take your point. I think it's a fair point that certainly none of the founders wanted to enshrine the idea that we had essentially a rigid and unchangeable Constitution. I agree with that.
Okay, great. Let's stay with you over here, Clark. You touched on this a little bit earlier about possibly there being reasonable ways to place further regulations on the selling and purchasing and ownership of firearms as opposed to a flat-out ban. To you, what might those reasonable ways look like?
Everything you see on the books today, in these kinds of discussions, it can be easy to lose sight of the fact that the Second Amendment has not been held to stand in the way of anything. You can have literally any policy you want, as restrictive as you want, short of a complete ban. That is the only thing the Supreme Court has ever held that the Second Amendment prohibits. So if you want to have waiting periods, if you want to have extremely burdensome licensing requirements, if you want to restrict the number of people who can have guns, if you want it to be over a certain age, if you want it to be only people who go to a psychiatrist and get tested and so forth, you can have all of that. And in fact, we have a ton of it. Some jurisdictions are extraordinarily zealous about regulating access to handguns to the point where you can get a handgun almost anywhere, but there are several major jurisdictions where it's very difficult, unless you're famous, to get a concealed carry permit. And that's not a swipe by, that's actually true. If you look at who has a concealed carry permit in New York City, it's famous people. Including the publisher of the New York Times, Art Sulzberger, which is odd because his paper takes the other side of that issue. But anyway, so what you see when you look around in terms of how states approach gun policy, it runs the gamut. So if your desire is to have extremely restrictive gun regulations, that's absolutely something you can get if you can persuade a Democratic majority to enact them. And again, short of a complete ban, no court is going to stand in your way. You can have pretty much everything you can convince your fellow citizens to support, but that's the problem. There is broad support in this country for individual gun ownership. And in most jurisdictions, through their democratic process, people have enacted laws that permit fairly broad access to guns. And in most states, pretty much anybody who wants to get a permit to carry their gun outside of their home can get that permit. In fact, there's several states where you don't even need a permit. And all of that was done democratically. Which takes me back to my initial point, and I think maybe the most important point that I can make tonight, and that is, when you're talking about issues of public policy and you want to move the needle in your direction, you have to engage with people who disagree. You have to figure out, how do they see the world? What are the facts as those people see them? You have to acquaint yourself with the research, with the studies that are out there. It doesn't mean you have to believe all of it, but if you won't acquaint yourself with your opponent's worldview, you cannot hope to persuade them. And that's really what it will take to change gun policy in America. For those of you who want to change it, for those of you who want to see it more regulated, you are going to have to persuade your friends and neighbors to change their minds. Because the way America is now, basically a gun culture with lots of guns and easy access, that wasn't foisted off on us by the courts, and it wasn't a feature of our Constitution. That's because Democratic majorities have chosen those policies. And to change them, you have to go back to the same process, the political process. This has very little to do with the courts, and that's maybe the most important point that I could share with you.
Can I just respond in actually in three ways to Clark's very good points? But first, Clark paints a picture in which jurisdictions, whether it be state jurisdictions or municipal jurisdictions, can pretty much do anything they want in terms of regulation, that there's a lot of leeway. I'm not sure that that's the case. It's true that courts aren't throwing out pieces of legislation as unconstitutional right and left, but I do think that the politics of the Second Amendment in some ways dampens legislation that would otherwise be there. So, and I think this is one of the effects of Heller, and actually one of the effects of our Second Amendment high politics as well. I mean, you would have expected, with the number of mass shootings, you would have expected jurisdictions, whether it be municipalities or states, to be adopting all sorts of things. And I don't see they're doing that. And I think that's happening or not happening for a couple reasons. One is that I think they fear litigation after Heller. I think they don't want to write laws, and they're reminded by constituents who are pro-gun that if they do write laws, they will be contested and taken to the Supreme Court. So there is a fear of litigation out there, which I think is dampening some of these laws. And the second is just pure and simple interest group politics. One of the problems we have in this country, and Clark alluded to it. For some people, the suboptimal aspect of our government. For others, perhaps maybe it's an optimal aspect, but it is very hard to pass much legislation, at least at the national level. And one reason I think is interest group politics and campaign finance, certainly. And I think there's enough rhetoric and high rhetoric because people on each side are very defensive about these positions that it's very hard to get any legislation through. So I think that's going on. A second point, I think I agree with Clark I'm going to put out two assumptions, one of which I think you agree with, the other which I don't think you do. The first assumption is that I agree that most of us, for understandable reasons, believe that there is probably an individual right to bear arms. I would grant that. But the second thing is that most of us believe that guns pose a very serious public health risk. And I think you subordinated that a little bit, or at least gave it short shrift. You told some stories about the correct use of a gun, or at least an optimal use of the gun in some situations, and I have no doubt that that happens. But we also know about the other side of the ledger of accidents and other bits of misuse. And we know that even police officers have a very hard time engaging correctly with firearms. And so there's no doubt that there's some accidents and other episodes of misuse. And then the question for me then, the public health question is, what is the probability of misuse as against the probability of sound use or good, valid use of the gun? And that's what I think public health researchers need to look into. And I'm not so sure that the data comes out as favorably as you like on that, but I think it needs a lot more research. But the third thing, let me say one more thing about this. I mentioned that one thing that the Second Amendment is doing is dampening down legislation. I think when our government works best, we have this nice laboratory of democracy in which municipalities and states are developing all sorts of prescriptions to balance our various rights. And those are hard things to do. You can't have a one-size-fits-all policy for guns. New York and rural Texas are two very different places, and you need municipalities to weigh in on those things. And we need the kind of experimentation that's gone on in things like what our government's done about the challenge of dangerous substances, and whether it be medicine or what we've done about cars. There are a lot of lessons in which if we can draw from state regulations on both of those things, which I think is some way the kind of innovation we need in guns.
I think it's important to understand, I don't disagree with any of that, except to say that everything you just said is already going on. So we have an ongoing national experiment about whether certain gun policies work better than others. Some people might be surprised to find out that one of the states where there are no gun laws on the books, you can walk into any bank, any restaurant, with as many pistols on your body as you want, with no permission from the state, is Vermont. It's been that way for decades. Yeah. And it doesn't seem to have any connection. The permissiveness or the restrictiveness of gun laws, no one's ever been able to show any causal connection. And by the way, they've looked at it. The CDC so the Center for Disease Control and the National Academy of Sciences did a meta-study, looked at 200 studies to see if anybody had ever been able to establish a causal relationship between gun regulations and policy outcomes. And they concluded no one's ever been able to do it. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but these things are being looked at. We had a massive national experiment in the mid-1980s. Before 1987, there were almost no states where people had easy access to concealed carry permits. It was very difficult in almost every jurisdiction to get one. Florida broke that trend in 1987 and passed what's now called a shall issue concealed carry law, meaning if you don't have a criminal background and you don't have mental health programs, they have to give you a concealed carry permit. And gun opponents took a very big stake when that happened and said, if other states follow suit, there will be blood in the streets. There will be an immediate spike in gun deaths. There will be innocent bystanders getting shot as irresponsible gun owners slug it out in the streets, et cetera. None of that happened. And by the way, there is unanimous agreement among everybody. And I've been part of the gun policy debate for 15 years. Not even gun opponents try to argue this anymore. Everybody agrees that nothing happened. None of that came to pass. And so predictions were made, they were tested, and they were falsified. Again, that doesn't mean you can't have gun regulations if you want them. You absolutely can. You can have almost anything you want. The problem is we've been experimenting with this for decades, and there doesn't seem to be any connection. Vermont is one of the most liberal gun states in the country, and they don't have much gun crime. By contrast, here in Chicago is one of the most restrictive in the country up until well, it still is, but up until the McDonald decision in 2010, it was one of the 2 most restrictive jurisdictions in the country, and they had the highest gun homicide rate with DC, the other most restrictive jurisdiction. So you have to be very careful about arguing causation, which I'm not doing, by the way. I'm just saying there is no causation either way. None of this. There's just no correlation. And I guess the last thing I would say is that I really disagree that the Second Amendment has had any kind of limiting effect on the interest or willingness of politicians to enact restrictions. Right here, well, not here, but not far from here in Highland Park, Illinois, they're one of the few jurisdictions with a fairly robust assault weapons ban. That was challenged in court, and the 7th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld it. It's still on the books. The problem is it doesn't do anything. And we know this, again, because we had a national assault weapons ban, and basically everybody agrees that enacting it didn't change anything, and then when it expired, had a sunset provision. When it expired, that didn't change anything. So I think the real frustration here for a lot of people who are in favor of gun regulations is not that they can't, that there's some restriction or some inability, constitutional inability to get passed. I think it's twofold. First, there's not much political appetite for increasing the amount of gun restrictions we have. And second, it's virtually impossible to find any empirical evidence that any of them do anything, that they produce any positive public policy outcomes. And so it's just hard to get traction when you try to persuade somebody to change their mind and support gun control, because you're not going to be able to show any valid scientific research showing that they do anything good. It's just not out there.
Let me come in on this if I
please go
can.
ahead.
Okay, so a couple of things on Clark's last remarks. One, that there's no appetite for maybe more restrictions on guns. I'm not so sure about that. You know, I know there's resistance, but let's look at this current campaign. We noticed that Hillary Clinton has started to use sort of gun restrictions in many of her campaign speeches. And she's smart. We know that Hillary has focus grouped this to death. And I think she realizes that guns is in some ways a winning campaign point for her. And it's not just because she recognizes a vulnerability for Bernie on this, although I think that's also the case. But I think Bernie's in a rearview mirror, and she's realizing even in the general debate that guns actually, some gun restrictions play well in the general public. So I think there is a growing appetite for doing something, the right thing, I'll say. Certainly not prohibition, but the right thing. And the second thing about the effects of gun laws, I'm not sure that's the case either. So Clark, some of the data you cite are just that, you know, some of the jurisdictions that have restrictive gun laws don't have fewer accidents and that sort of thing. I think we need a much better research design to tease out some of those effects. And I'm just speaking like a social scientist. But I think what unfortunately has happened is there hasn't been much appetite on the sort of gun lobby side to actually conduct that research. And we know obviously there've been restrictions put in place at the federal level such that federal money couldn't be used for public health studies on guns. Which is surprising in some ways, right? If we're going to actually allow municipalities to conduct, to put together policy, we want to do it in an evidence-based way, and we want the evidence out there. And some of the things that I would have expected we would see, we don't see. So things like at this level, things like you know, for drug research and for automobiles, there's always pre-approval. The government has pre-approval of some of these models, whether it be drugs or automobiles. That's something that gun manufacturers, as you know, Clark, because we've talked about this, are doing very well right now. And I think in some ways, if they were assured that the individual right to bear arms is not going anywhere, I think they'd be okay about getting pre-approval for some of their models. Another thing that I would have expected to see in the way of innovation is insurance programs. So just like for cars, gun owners might actually take out liability insurance in the case of any accident. I haven't seen much of that. I would have expected more in terms of licensing requirements. It still seems to me in most states very easy to get a gun license. I would have expected more experimentation along those lines. And I would have expected a lot more experimentation with respect to technology. And this gets to pre-approval of some designs, but I would have expected advancement in terms of sort of micro stamping of shell casings and advanced trigger locks, personal trigger locks using technology and that sort of thing. I'm not seeing that, and I would have expected in an environment in which gun policy is not so politicized, I would have expected to see those sorts of things.
Clark, I think we have time, if you have 1 or 2 points in
Sure.
response to that, and then I do want to make sure we save time for questions from the audience.
Let me assure you, you are seeing it. You may not be perceiving it, but we have had, in fact, a massive national experiment with gun restrictions. There were virtually none in the early part of the 20th century. That changed when New York adopted the so-called Sullivan Law. That was the nation's first handgun law. By the way, everybody pretty well agrees that it was aimed at immigrants. And following that, we went from basically total permissiveness to almost total prohibition, back to significant permissiveness. And by the way, this issue has been exhaustively studied. I mean, just go online I can't pull out all the research here, but trust me, it's been exhaustively studied. Including, by the way, defensive gun uses and how often people use guns to prevent crime or save themselves from attacks. Just Google that term, defensive gun uses, and it'll be like drinking from a fire hose. And I eliminated the most sort of ridiculously low and ridiculously high estimates and just gave you sort of the fat center that virtually everybody agrees on. But I don't think that's really what the point is, because that's gun policy. We're never talking about gun policy. I want to just come back really quickly to what the actual debate topic is tonight, and that is whether to amend the Second Amendment. And I just wanted to remind the audience kind of how I see it in terms of what the possibilities are. So possibility one is to eliminate the Second Amendment. We already know what that looks like because the courts treated it as if it didn't exist for 217 years, during which time gun culture flourished. So that's not going to achieve anything if you want to lessen the presence of guns in this country. Second, you can clarify it, but it sounds like Zach and I are basically in agreement that the only thing you can really do there is simply say, yeah, Heller got it right. So you can have restrictions, which we do, but you have to respect the core individual right to own a gun, which is, again, the status quo. So if you don't like the status quo, that's not your option. And the third possibility is to explicitly prohibit guns, to have an amendment that prohibits guns the way we prohibited alcohol in 1919. And I'll just leave with this. No national prohibition of anything has ever worked anywhere, ever. Not alcohol prohibition, not drug prohibition, which was our next experiment in this country, nothing. You just simply cannot suppress an entire category of items or activities that a significant chunk of people want to participate in, because they'll continue to do it. And you'll have to get increasingly draconian in what you're prepared to do to people who disagree. And if you want to see what increasingly draconian looks like in the context of a national prohibition, check out our drug war stats. But not after you've eaten, because good luck holding your meal down.
All right, thank you, Clark. Thank you, Zach. That'll conclude the questions from the moderator segment. I want to make sure to leave some time for questions from you all. And these can be directed to either of our debaters or to both of them. So if anyone has a question at this time, please raise your hand. Sure, go ahead. Let's start here this way.
My name's Alex. My name's Alex. I'm a first year in the college. This is for Clark. So you mentioned that the data finds that defensive gun use far outweighs the gun travesties that we see.
I didn't say that. I never said that. I said that there is a significant number of them, and some people do think there's a higher number. I didn't take that position.
Precisely, but if the number is high, right, that other point is insignificant. So if that number is so high, every time you see a mass shooting, you see politicians get in the media and talk about the fact that we need to address the Second Amendment, address the NRA, address special interests. I feel like there must be a more nuanced answer than, it's blind partisanship and they're ignoring the data. Are politicians and experts simply ignoring these facts, or is there something else to it that says, we need to address gun travesties from a different approach than we address the gun regulations that, allow for defensive gun use?
I appreciate the question. Thank you. So I want to try to answer what I think I heard you say, but if I don't get it right, let me know, because I definitely want to engage with you on this question. The apparent discrepancy between how often guns are used to commit atrocities and mass killings and how often guns seem to be used for legitimate defensive uses, I think, is attributable primarily to the following. When there is a mass shooting, every single news outlet in the country picks it up, and everybody knows that it happens. When there is a successful defensive gun use, the person who used a gun to defend themselves generally does not get on the phone to the media and say, hey, I just used a gun, which was probably illegal. They are often illegal uses. And I'd like you to publicize it, preferably with my picture and my name and my home address so the authorities can find me more easily. So a fair amount of this is happening below the radar screen. Frankly, in perhaps even somewhat sketchy circumstances where one drug dealer is about to get ambushed by another one and saves his own life with a gun. Maybe we don't think that's a legitimate use. So that to me is probably the main explanation, is that when we have a real tragedy like this shooting in San Bernardino, everybody hears about it. But when you have a successful defensive gun use, there can be very strong reasons why all of the people involved do not wish that information to become public.
Next, I think there was a question over here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jahan. I'm an alumnus of the Harris School. I have a question. So something I find interesting is the distinction between sort of possession at home and concealed carry permits. And so I wonder if you were to sort of clarify the Constitution, would you do anything on that? Would you say the right includes, say, concealed carry? Would you be silent? Would you say it doesn't include? So if you could maybe speak a bit about that.
Yeah, so, well, it's an interesting question. When I was actually, a couple weeks ago, I was looking through state constitutions to see what they've said about this, because of course we have our Second Amendment, but every state constitution, most of them at least, have something to say about guns. And if you read their gun provisions, or at least gun right provisions, most of them say something about concealed carry. That is, they're okay about open carry, but not about concealed carry. And by the way, I think this is confusing for a lot of people. They think, which one's okay? Is it open or concealed? And I think it really depends on the situation, obviously. And Clark probably has something to say about this as well. But I think at the level of the Constitution, I don't think it makes sense to say too much about concealed versus open. In part because, as I said, this is very much a local matter, and there's not a one-size-fits-all thing, and a constitution should be a one-size-fits-all thing. So I think in that sense, it can only really say something very abstract and very general. With respect to concealed carry, so this is, in some ways, has become very personal for my colleagues at the University of Texas, and now Clark is going to teach a course there next fall, so you'll be dealing with this as well. But starting in August 2016, we now have a concealed carry permit for those on campus, as many of you know. And this has caused all sorts of consternation. It's unclear to many. The same conversation and the same question that you asked is going on in corridors about whether that makes us safer or less safe. And I would, in part, say this. I mean, I think some of the constitutional things that I'm recommending, at least clarifying the Second Amendment, I'm not sure that that is going to have any effect on mass shootings, at least the kind that go on at universities or places like that. I think there's lots of good evidence on the ratio of misuse to use, and I actually think that ratio is higher than Clark does. But we could go to the evidence on that. But with respect to mass shootings, I'm not sure that any of these regulations are going to do much, if anything. I mean, I think that these mass shootings might inspire people to think about guns, what we should do about guns. But I'm not sure in the end that anything we do, especially at the constitutional level, is going to do much about those.
I would just, if I could add one thing, so we do know that the U.S. Constitution says keep and bear strongly suggests carry around. If we were talking about amending it, which we are, so we can, then it would sort of be a question, I think, again, how would you go about persuading people that we should restrict that to just keep in your home. And I think, I mean, I don't know, I've never tried to do it, but I think you would probably have to be able to show people that there's actually evidence that allowing people to carry guns outside of their homes with, with a license, because that's how you do it, except in Vermont, Arizona, Idaho, and Alaska, but in most of the country, that's how you have to do it, has actually led to significantly worse policy outcomes. In other words, more people are getting shot in the streets and so forth and so on. And my position is you won't find it. I have looked. Lots of really smart people have looked. And there are limits to the ability to just say, well, there's got to be a study out there that would show it. There really isn't. And so, you're going to, if you're going to propose literally kind of cutting the Second Amendment in half, okay, so just keep and not bear, you're going to have to be really persuasive. You're not just going to have to be able to find like one study. You're going to have to be able to show, look, there's virtually unanimous consensus among criminologists that there'd be a lot less gun violence and gun death if we just took bear out of it and didn't let people carry guns or didn't constitutionally protect carry outside of the house. I will tell you that issue has been looked at. And by the way, we had that national experiment I was talking about. In the 1980s, early 1980s, virtually impossible to carry outside the home in most states. After 1987, super easy to do. Nothing changed. And nobody disputes that. Who knows about the issue? Nothing changed.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and I saw a hand over here. And just a reminder, for those of you who don't get to ask your question at this time, feel free to come up to us after the debate is over to ask your question if we don't get to you. Yes, please go ahead.
I guess this is for Lewis.
I'm Clark.
Clark, hi Clark.
But I love the historical suggestion there.
Good start here. I appreciate hearing your arguments. You're calm and articulate. I would take it that you're sort of the creme de la creme defense of these positions. Therefore, I'm kind of surprised that I still find them highly unpersuasive.
Yep.
As a citizen, I guess I feel personally wounded by the concept that public health risks can be judged entirely from a quantified basis. When 13-year-olds are going into kindergartens and shooting a bunch of young kids, and every 3 months somebody's walking into a college classroom and shooting up people, this is an indication there's something sick and rageful going on in our culture, and that it's not a matter of quantifying the public health risk. And I think that an equivalent situation in terms of that would be, look at what happened when 3,000 people died in the World Trade Center. I don't think the US government, I'm not defending any action they took, by the way, said, well, hey, 20,000 people died in a typhoon in Bangladesh a few years ago, so hey, let's swallow it and move on. There was far-ranging reactions. So I just wanted to put that forward.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and let me respond. It gives me an opportunity to respond and hopefully clarify a point. I never meant to suggest that gun policy should be decided on the basis of, well, this many people, used a gun, or this many people were shot, by criminals. I think the Constitution runs deeper than that, and the framers chose a way for America to be, which is that unlike most countries, American citizens are trusted with guns. They are permitted to own guns individually. In fact, they have a right to do it. What I would say is, because that's the baseline, because not only does the Constitution say that, but even after 200 years of the courts completely ignoring the Second Amendment, which they did, we still became a gun culture. America has the highest per capita gun ownership of any country in the world. It is by far the easiest to carry guns in America of anywhere in the world, and that has nothing to do with the court's interpretation of the Second Amendment. We chose those policies as a democracy. So my response would be, it doesn't really matter what I think about the issue. If you want to change the policies that are on the books now, you are going to have to convince people who see it differently. You are going to have to convince the significant majority of American citizens. By the way, I actually have the polling data here. I looked at the Rasmussen polling website just this morning. A majority of Americans actually do believe that current gun policies make America safer. And that having carry permits or widespread carry permits do reduce the number of people who are killed in violent incidents. I also believe that. It may be false. My only point is, if you want to change gun policy, you are going to have to convince people who see it that way that they are wrong. And they may be wrong, but it is a challenge. to change people's minds, as I think I've inadvertently, I predicted that it would be difficult, and I wasn't really going to set out to do it. I would close with this. I appreciate being given the opportunity to talk about this issue here at FIRE and Zach's willingness to engage in good faith, but mostly appreciate you guys. I mean, this was a very civil discussion, and I think that it speaks well of America as a country that we can talk about something this emotional and we can do it respectfully. And so I appreciate your question and the questions and participation from everyone else and the opportunity to be here and discuss respectfully. So thank you.
Great. Did you have any points in response to that?
Are we closing, or is it response to that?
If you have nothing else there, we can move on to closing statements.
Let's see, I guess a few points, and by way of closing, if we're going that way.
Sure.
I mean, I feel like we're at this point in US politics in which we're highly polarized in many ways. And the worst part about political polarization, I think, is that it's not because we differ with respect to actual content and ideology. It's that we disagree about who's saying whatever it is. I think that's the worst part about polarization, that you would probably agree with what the other side is saying if somebody else were saying that. And I think that's why it's nice to have something like gun rights, in which I think there is broad agreement. I think Clark and I have showed that tonight. But I want to go back to the founders a little bit, because in some ways we're calling into question what they did. And only in this way. I mean, the founders sat down in Philadelphia in 1787 in the summer. And I think of it as a summer project, sometimes a very successful summer project. And they were writing a constitution for an agrarian society of 4 million people. And that's just very different from the society we live in. A more industrialized, obviously, society, more urban society in many places. 80% of us live in cities. And I think we're at the point now in which we need sort of a more nuanced approach to guns that most of us agree with. I was thinking, I always wonder what James Madison would say if he were brought here in some sort of time travel. It's always fun to think about time travel, of course, but especially with respect to James Madison. And I think if we flew him here on a Boeing 777 and gave him an iPhone and let him FaceTime with Thomas Jefferson, he might say, you know, whoa, you're still using our Constitution? I think he'd be a little surprised. I think he'd be really surprised. And he was also a political scientist in many ways, and so he knew the effect of institutions. And I think he'd realize that, okay, maybe the US Constitution was in many ways the first modern constitution, but since then there have been about 900 other constitutions across the world. And now we have the luxury to actually learn a little bit about what those other constitutions have done, not just on gun rights, but on the many other things. And I think James Madison would say, listen, let's put those to work and let's see what we can do. And maybe the technology of governance has improved a little bit. Maybe political scientists have learned a little bit about how to set up these laws and a little bit about what works. So I'll just stop there.
Sure. Okay, go ahead, Clark.
Yeah, let me return to that same place and to disagree respectfully in the spirit of the debate. I don't think James Madison would be surprised we were still using the Constitution. I think he'd be gratified. And the reason I don't think that he or his fellow founders would be surprised is because I think they knew that they had stumbled upon a truth that has rarely in the history of humankind been embodied in the founding and controlling documents of any country in the history of humankind. And the truth is this: governments exist to protect the individual rights of citizens. That's what Thomas Jefferson meant when he said in the Declaration of Independence that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that governments are created to protect the pursuit of unalienable rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it's important to understand what an incredible watershed moment that was in history when a bunch of people came along and said, you know what? Individuals don't exist to serve government. It's exactly the other way around. And what that means is that before the government can restrict your freedom, whether it's a freedom to decide who to have sex with, what to put in your body, how to express your views, where to worship, and yes, whether to have a gun at home for self-defense or perhaps even carry it outside your house, it is the government that must come up with an extremely persuasive explanation why that particular freedom should be denied to you. It is not your job as an individual to justify your exercise of liberty to the government. I think that was an absolutely genius insight, and I don't think that the founding fathers and mothers of this country would be the least bit surprised to find out that because we are still more or less embracing that principle, we are still using their Constitution, and we are still the most prosperous and close to the most freest country in the world, and I think they'd be extremely gratified and not surprised.
Good. Thank you, Clark. I would like to take this time to thank both of our debaters for being here tonight and for presenting their respective viewpoints in such an eloquent and clear and precise manner. Thank you to the Institute of Politics and the University of Chicago for hosting this debate this evening. Thank you to my FIRE colleagues for making this event possible. And most of all, thanks to all of you for attending. And like I said, if we didn't get to your question, feel free to come up to any of us with your questions after we are concluded here. And yeah, thank you. Hey, great job. Very well done. Yeah, absolutely. Great job. Very well done. Thank you.